And now, three tales from Hans Christian Andersen. The Thistle's experiences. Belonging to the lordly manor house was a beautiful, well-kept garden, with rare trees and flowers. The guests of the proprietor declared their admiration of it. The people of the neighbourhood from their town and country came on Sundays and holidays and asked for permission to see the garden. Indeed, whole schools used to pay visits to it. Outside the garden, by the palings of the roadside, stood a great mighty thistle, which spread out in many directions from the root, so that it might have been called a thistle bush. Nobody looked at it except for the old donkey who drew the milkmaid's cart. This donkey used to stretch his neck out towards the thistle and say, "You are beautiful. I should like to eat you." But his halter was not long enough to let him reach it and eat it. There was great company at the manor house, some very noble people from the capital, young pretty girls, among them a young lady who came from a long distance. She had come from Scotland, and was of high birth, and was rich in land and gold, a bride worth winning. Said more than one of the young gentlemen, and their lady mothers said the same thing. The young people amused themselves on the lawn, and played at ball. They wandered among the flowers, and each of the young girls broke off a young flower, and fastened it to a young gentleman's buttonhole. Such as the young Scotch lady looked round, but a long time in an undecided way. None of the flowers seemed to suit her taste. Then her eye glanced the paling, outside, and the great thistle bush, with a reddish hue, sturdy flowers. She saw them. She smiled, asked the son of the house to pluck one for her. "It is the flower of Scotland," she said. "It blooms in the Scotland of my country. Give me yonder flower." As he brought the fairest blossom, and pricked his fingers as completely as if it had grown on the sharpest rose bush, she placed the thistle flower in the buttonhole of the young man, and he felt himself highly honoured. Each of the young gentlemen would have willingly given his own beautiful flower to have worn this one, presented by the fair hand of the Scottish maiden. And as if the son of his house felt himself honoured, what were the feelings of the thistle bush? It seemed to him that the dew and the sunshine were streaming through him. "I am something more than I know of," said the thistle to itself. "I suppose my right place is really outside the palings, and I have not myself one strangely placed in this world. But now I have at least managed to get one of my people beyond the pale, and indeed within to a buttonhole." The thistle told this event to every blossom that had folded itself, and not many days had gone by before the thistle heard, not from men, not from the twittering of the birds, but from the air itself, which stores up the sounds and carries them far around, not through the tired walks of the garden, out through the rooms of the house, in which doors and windows stood open, that the young gentlemen who had received the thistle flower from the hand of their fair Scottish maiden now received the heart and the hand of the lady in question. They were a handsome pair, and it was a good match. "That match I made up," said the thistle, and he thought of the flower they had given for the buttonhole. Every flower opened heard of this occurrence. "I surely shall be transported in the garden," thought the thistle, "and perhaps into a pot, which crowds one in. That is said to be the highest of all honours." Then the thistle pictured this to himself in a lively manner, and at last he said with full conviction, "I am to be transplanted into a pot." Then he promised every little thistle flower which unfolded itself that it should also be put into a pot, perhaps one into a buttonhole, the highest honour that could be attained. But not one of them was put into a pot, much less into a buttonhole. They drank in the sunlight and air, lived on the sunlight by day, and by the dew by night, bloomed and were visited by bees and hornets, who looked after the honey, the dowry of the flower. Then they took the honey and left the flower where it was. "Thievish rabble," said the thistle. "If only I could stab one of them, but I cannot." The flowers hung their heads and faded, but after a new time, new ones came. "You come in good time," said the thistle. "I am expecting any moment to get across the fence." A few innocent daisies, a long thin dandelion stood and listened in deep admiration, and believed anything they heard. The old donkey of the milk cart stood at the edge of the field road, and glanced across at the blooming white thistle bush, but his halter was too short, and he could not reach it. And the thistle thought long of the thistle of Scotland, whose family he said he belonged to, that he fancied at last that he should come from Scotland, and his parents should have been born to the national escutcheon. That was a great thought, you see, but a great thistle has a right to a great thought. "One is often so grand as a family that may not know it," said the nettle, who grew close by. He had kind of an idea that he might to be made into cambric if he were not treated. And as the summer went by, and the autumn went by, The leaves fell from the trees, and the few flowers left had deeper colours and less scent. The gardener boy sang in the garden across the palings. Up the hill, down the dale we went. That is life from beginning to end. The young fir trees in the forest began to long for Christmas, but it was a long time to Christmas yet. Here I am standing yet. It seems that no one's thought of me, and yet I managed to match. They were betrothed, they have had their wedding, and it is a week ago. I won't sleep a single step, 'cause I won't. And a few more weeks went by, and the thistle stood there in its last single flower, large and tall. This flower had shot up near the roots. The wind blew cold over it, and the colours had vanished, and the flower grew in size and looked as a silvered sunflower. One day the young pair, now man and wife, came into the garden. They went along the paling, and the young wife looked across it. There's the great thistle still growing, she said. It has no flowers now. Ah, yes, the ghost of the last one is still there, still, said he, and pointed to the silvery remains of the flower, which used, and looked to the flower themselves. It is pretty, certainly. One must have carved a frame on our picture. And the young man had to climb across the palings again, and to break off the calyx of the thistle. He pricked his fingers, but then had called it a ghost, and this thistle calyx came into the garden, and into the house, and into the drawing room. There stood a picture of the young couple. A thistle flower was painted in the buttonhole of the bridegroom. They spoke about this, and about the thistle flower that they brought, the last thistle flower, now gleaming like silver, whose picture was carved in the frame. And the breeze carried what was spoken far away. What can one experience? Said the thistle bush. My firstborn was put into a buttonhole, and my youngest has been put into a frame. Where shall I go? And the donkey stood by the roadside and looked across at the thistle. Come to me, my nibble darling, he said. I can't get across to you. But the thistle did not answer. He became more and more thoughtful, kept on thinking and thinking till near Christmas, and a flower came forth. If the good children are only good, the parents did not mind standing outside the garden pale. That's an honourable thought, said the sunbeam. You shall have a good place. In a pot or in a frame, said the thistle. In a story, replied the sunbeam. Good luck can lie in a pin. Now I shall tell you a story about good luck. We all know good luck. Some of us see it from year's end to year's end. Others only know it in certain seasons, on a certain day. There are even people who see it only once in their lives, but see it we all do. Now, I need not tell you, for everyone knows it, that God sends the little child and lays it in a mother's lap, be it in the rich castle, in the well-to-do house, but it also might be in the cold field, where the wind blows. Everyone does not know, however, but it is true all the same, that God, when he brings the child, also brings a lucky gift for it, but it is not laid openly by its side. It is laid in some place around the world where one might least expect to find it, and yet it is always found. That is the best of it. It may be laid in an apple, for it was so with a learned man who is called Newton. The apple fell, and so he found his good luck. If you do not know the story, you can ask someone that knows it to tell it to you, for I have a story to tell. And it is a story about a pear. One day there was a man who was born in poverty. He grew up in poverty, and in poverty had married. He was a turner by trade and made, especially, umbrella handles and rings, but he only lived from hand to mouth. I never find good luck, he said. This is a story that really happened, and one could name the country and the place where the man lived, but it doesn't matter really. The red sour rowan berries grew in the richest profusion about his house and garden. In the garden there was also a pear tree, but it did not bear a single pear, and yet the good luck was laid in that pear tree, laid in the invisible pears. One night the wind blew a terrible storm. They told in the newspapers that the great big stagecoach was lifted off the road and thrown aside like a rag. It could very well happen that a great branch was broken off the pear tree. The branch was put into the workshop, and the man, as a joke, made a big pear out of it, and then another big one, and a smaller one, and some very little ones. The tree must have some time to have other pears, the man said, and gave them to the children to play with. Out of necessities of life in a wet country is an umbrella. The whole house had only one for common use. If its wind blew too strongly, the umbrella turned inside out. It also snapped 2 or 3 times, but the man soon put it right again. The most provoking thing, however, was that the button held it together when it was true, often jumped out. All the ring that was around it broke in two. One day the button flew off, and the man searched for it on the floor. There got hold of one of the smallest of the wooden pears the children had got to play with. "This button is not to be found," said the man, "but this little thing will serve the same purpose." So he bored a hole in it, pulled a string through it, and the little pear fitted very well into the broken ring. It was assuredly the best fastener that the umbrella had ever had. Next year, when the man was selling umbrella handles to the town, as he regularly did, he also sent some of the little wooden pears and begged that they might be tried, and so that they came to America. So that they very soon noticed that the little pears held much better than any other button, and now were demanded that the merchants should all have the umbrellas that were sent should be fastened with a little pear. Now there was something to do. Pears in thousands, wooden pears on all umbrellas. The man set to work. He turned and turned. The whole pear tree was cut up into little pears. It brought pennies. It brought shillings. "My good luck was laid in the pear tree," said the man. Now he got a big workshop with men and boys. He was always in good humour and said, "Good luck can lie in a pin." I also, who tell the story, say so. People have a saying, "Take a white pin in your mouth and you will be invisible." But it must be right pin, and which one was given to us by a lucky gift by our Lord. I got that right, and I also got, like the man, can catch gold, gleaming gold, the very guess. The kind that shines from children's eyes, the kinds that sounds from children's mouths, from father and mother too. They read the stories, but I stand among them, in the middle of the room, but invisible. And I have the white pin in my mouth. If I see that I am delighted with what I told them, I also say, "Good luck can lie in a pin." The bell. In the narrow streets of a large town, people were often heard in the evenings, when the sun was setting. But the last rays gave a golden hymn, and the children puts a strange noise which resembled the sound of a church bell, though it lasted only an instant, was heard, and the continual roar of traffic and hum of voices which rose from the town. "The evening bell was ringing," people used to say. "The sun is setting." Those who walked outside the town, where the houses were left crowded and interspersed by gardens and little fields, saw the evening sky much better, and heard the sound of the bell much clearly. It seemed as though the sound came from a church, deep in the calm, fragrant wood, and thither people looked with devout feelings. And a considerable time elapsed, and one said to the other, "Really, I wonder if there is a church out in the woods. The bell has a strange, sweet sound. Shall we go out there and see what the cause of this is?" The rich drove, the poor walked, but the way seemed to them extraordinarily wrong. And when they arrived at a number of willow trees in the border of the wood, they sat down, looked up to the great branches, and thought they were now really in the wood. A confectioner came from the town and put up a stall there. He was covered with pitch to protect it from the rain, but the clapper was wanting. When people came home, they used to say that it had been very romantic, and that really means something else than really taking tea. 3 persons declared they had gone as far as the end of the wood. They had always heard the strange sound, but there it seemed to them it came from the town. One of them wrote verses about the bell, and when it seemed as though it was a voice of a mother speaking intelligent to a beloved child, no tune, he said, was sweeter than the sound of the bell. The emperor of the country heard it, and declared he could really find where the sound would come from, should receive the title Bell Ringer to the World, even if there was no bell at all. Now many came out to the wood for the sake of this splendid birth, but only one of them had gone far back enough with some sort of explanation. None of them had gone far enough, nor had he, nor had said the sound of the bell came from a large owl in a hollow tree. It was a wisdom owl, which continually knocked its head against the tree, but he was unable to say with certainty whether its head or its hollow of the trunk of the tree was the cause of the noise. He was appointed Bell Ringer to the World, and wrote every year a short dissertation on the owl, but by this means people did not become any wiser than they were before. It was a just confirmation day. The clergyman had delivered a beautiful and touching sermon. The candidates were deeply moved by it, for it was a very important day for them. They were all at once transformed from mere children to grown-up people, and the childish soul was to fly over, as if it were, into a more reasonable being. The sun shone most brightly, and the sound of the great unknown bell was heard more distinctly than before. They had a mind to go thither, except all 3. One of them wished to go home and try on her ball dress, for this very dress and this ball were the cause of her being confirmed for this time. Otherwise she would have been allowed to go. A second, a poor boy, had borrowed a coat and a pair of boots from the son of his landlord to be confirmed in, and had to return them at a certain time. The third said that he never went to strange places if his parents were not with him. He had always been a good child, and wished to remain so, and even after being confirmed, they ought not to tease him for this. They, however, did it all the same. These three, however, did not go. The others went on. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the confirmed children sang too, holding each other by the hand, for they had no petition yet, and they were all equal in the eyes of God. Two of the smallest soon became tired and returned to the town. Two little girls sat down and made garlands of flowers. They, therefore, did not go on. When the others arrived at the willow trees, where the confectioner put up his stall, they said, "Now we are out here. The bill does not in reality exist. It is only something that people imagine." Then suddenly the sound of the bell was heard so beautifully and solemnly from the wood that 4 or 5 of them made up their minds to go still further on. The wood was very thickly grown. It was difficult to advance. Wood lilies and anemones were most too high. Flowering convolvuli and brulas were hanging like garlands from tree to tree, where the nightingales were singing and the sunbeams played. That was very beautiful, but the way was unfit for the girls. They would have torn their dresses. Large rocks covered with moss of various hues were lying about. The fresh spring water rippled forth with a peculiar sound. "I don't think that can be the bell," said one of the confirmed children, and he lay down and listened. "We must try to find out what it is." There he remained and let the others walk on. They came to a hut built of the bark of the trees and the branches. A large crabapple tree spread its branches over it, as if it were intending to pour its fruit from the roof, upon which roses were blooming. The long boughs covered the gable, where a little bell was hanging. Was this the one they had heard? All agreed it must be so, except one who said the bell was too small and too thin to be heard at such a distance, and it had quite a different sound, to which said so touched men's hearts. One who spoke was a king's son, and therefore others said that some always wishes to be cleverer than other people. Therefore they let him go alone, and as he walked on, the solitude of the wood produced a feeling of reverence in his breast. Still he heard the little bell about which others rejoiced, and sometimes when the wind blew in that direction, he could hear the sound from the confectioner's stall, where the others were singing at tea. But the deep sounds of the bell were much stronger, and it seemed to him as if a organ played an accompaniment. The sound came from the left, from the side where the heart is. Now something rustled within the bushes, and a little boy stood there was the king's son, in the wooden shoes and such a short jacket. The sleeves did not reach to the wrists. They both knew each other. The boy was the one who had not been able to go with him, because he had to take the coats and the boots back to his landlord's son. That he had done, and he started again to his wooden shoes and his old clothes, for the sound of the bell was too enticing. He felt he must go on. "We might go together," said the singing son, but the poor boy in the wooden shoes was quite ashamed. He pulled the short sleeves of his jacket, and said he was afraid he could not walk so fast. Besides, he was of the opinion that the bell ought to be sought by the right, for there was all that was grand and magnificent. "Then we shall not meet," said the son, counting to the poor boy, who went into the deepest part of the wood, where the thorns tore his shabby clothes and scratched his hands, face, and feet until they bled. The king's son also received several good scratches, but the sun was shining on his way, and it was he that would follow, for he was a quick fellow. "I will and must find the bell," he said, "for if I have to go to the end of the world." Ugly monkeys sat high in the branches and clenched their teeth. "Shall we beat him?" they said. "Shall we thrash him? He's a king's son." But he walked off undaunted, deeper and deeper into the woods, where the most wonderful flowers were growing. There were standing white star lilies with blood-red stamens, sky-blue tulips shining where the wind moved them, apple trees covered with apples, with large glittering soap bubbles. Only think how resplendent those trees were in the sunshine. All around there were green meadows where hart and hind played in the grass. There grew magnificent oaks and beech trees, as if the bark was split out of many of them. Long blades of grass grew out of the clefts. There were also about large smooth lakes in the woods, which swans were swimming about and flapping their wings. The king's son often stood and listened, and sometimes he thought that the sound of the bell rose up to him out of these deep lakes, but soon found this was a mistake, and that the bell was ringing farther in the wood. Then the sun set, and the clouds were red as fire. It became quiet in the wood. He sank down on his knees, sang an evening hymn, and said, I shall never find what I'm looking for. Now the sun is setting, and the dark night is approaching. Net I mayhaps see round the sun much more, and before he disappears beneath that horizon, I will climb up these rocks. They are as high as the highest trees. Then, taking hold of the creepers and the roots, he climbed up on the wet stones, where water snakes were wiggling, and the toads, as it were, barked at him. He had reached the top before the sun, seen from such great height, had quite set. Oh, what a splendor! The sea, the great majestic sea, which was rolling on its long waves against the shore, stretched out before him. The sun was standing before a light broad arch, where the sea and the heaven met. It all melted together in the midst of the glowing colours. The wood was singing, and his heart too. The whole of nature was great, holy church, in which the glass and the green and the trees and the hovering clouds formed the pillars, the flowers and the grass wove the velvet carpet, and heaven itself was the great cupola. There, among velvet flame, vanished as soon as the sun disappeared. But millions of stars were lighted, diamond lamps were shining, and the king's son stretched his arms out towards heaven, towards the sea, and towards the wood. Then suddenly the sword, and with a short sleeved jacket and the wooden shoes, appeared. He had arrived just as quickly as the road he had chosen, and they ran towards each other, and took each other's hand. In the great cathedral of nature and poesy, and beneath them, sounded the invisible holy bell. What happy spirits surrounded them, singing hallelujahs and rejoicing. This concludes the 3 tales of Christian Andersen. Tune in for more.